Every podcast episode, I ask my guest how long have they been an actor and when did they feel confident to call themselves that. Actors notoriously find it quite tricky to actually say, yes, I'm an actor. So I'd like to know, how long have you been a writer and when did you feel confident? Do you feel confident to say, yes, I'm a writer when you're in your Uber?
Sure. I've been a freelance writer for about 20 years, almost now. And yeah, I feel pretty confident saying I'm a writer in terms of having put out 2 books. I think the second book kind of makes it feel a bit more real. It's like the first one you're sort of going, can I do this? How do I do this? And make a bunch of messes. And then the second one you learn a lot of lessons, I suppose. So there's a great Saul Bellow quote where he says, your first book is like your master's and your second book is like your PhD. So I'm quite excited what the postdoctoral work will be. And then I was telling that quote to a friend the other day, and she came back with this great Michael Pollan quote, which is like, the first 2 books are starting to form the constellation, and then, or they're stars on the constellation, and the third book cements the constellation. So again, it's like, not to talk about the third book, which doesn't exist even as a concept.
I'm like, okay.
We need to talk about the second one, but,
book, yeah.
But in terms of confidence, yeah, I think I say I'm a writer, yeah.
Yeah, awesome, and so you should, and so should we all say what we are. So the book is based on 4 different actors Australian actors who have gone over to Hollywood throughout time. So it's also kind of a cinematic history, which was amazing and interesting to read. The first actor is Errol Flynn, and in it he was inspired by this quote, which actually I wrote down, where did we come from, what are we, and where are we going? And I thought that was quite a good quote to connect the book, but also the acting industry. Of course, the industry itself has gone through this history, which is explored in the book, and it's kind of got an interesting future, particularly in America with all the strikes and things at the moment. What do you think, though, Sam, is important about the history in particular, and how do you think we can get people interested and excited about old films and actors, especially in the age of streaming?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think they should read Castmates to start,
Yes,
because it's
absolutely.
a really good introductory book.
Totally.
It has a select filmography at the back, which my publisher Harriet recommended I write.
Yes, and absolutely, that was one of my most exciting things when I got to the end. I went, gee, I'm going to have to try and find some of these films. And there's literally a list at the end which has that. Awesome.
But yeah, one of the engines of writing the book was really thinking about older films and what we're going to do with older films. So, you know, I think I was writing the book thinking we're at this point in time where we're coming up to this rolling number of centenary anniversaries. So in about, what year is it, 2023?
Yes.
In 4 years, we're going to come up to 100 years of sound in cinema. So with the Jazz Singer in 1927, you know, we're quickly getting through a bunch of centenaries with silent films at the moment. So that kind of historical context was in the back of my mind, and thinking about where did Australian film start. And yeah, maybe animated by a little bit of frustration and anger with this kind of new era of streaming where it can be quite difficult to find older films. I mean, if you think about the biggest stream out there, Netflix, really it started, you know, as a film library of DVDs, as you know, it was a postal service with sending out DVDs. And really, if you think about streamers, just in a kind of functional way, they're essentially film libraries, they're archives, because they host content and then you select that content. It's a library, really, rather than a television station where things are programmed. So you're sort of going in there and finding things, and you can sort of quickly realise there isn't anything before 1959, say. Like, you'll get a few smattering of films from the 60s, you know, all the James Bond archive is there, but nothing kind of obscure or outside the kind of traditional interest. So that was definitely there from the start, and trying to source some of the Errol Flynn films and certainly the Peter Finch films that I write about in the book were pretty big digs to try and find it. They weren't on the streaming services, so yeah.
Mm. And also, I guess, what you talk about in the book is the links between the Australian cinema history and the American. And then, of course, I mean, I was with a friend the other day and we were looking on Netflix and she literally said, not knowing about this event, I was like, oh, thank you, I'll write that down. She literally said, gee, it's hard to find anything that's just Australian or find anything that's not American. And I found that a really interesting thing for someone to say, but also in your book, you talk a lot about that kind of intertwining of the two industries.
No, totally. And like, you know, American market domination can feel like a bit of a cliche, but there were things that I didn't quite realise in writing the book. So really the American studios had a huge hand in Australia in the early 20th century, to the point that they actually owned most of the cinemas. Hoyts was actually owned by 20th Century Fox from the 1930s onwards, which actually created a kind of market control where they could really suppress the making of Australian films. And if you think about the streamers now, well, they're mostly American owned, right? Like, why would Netflix have an interest in housing Australian film? Why would, you know, Paramount, or, you know, they're the same kind of studios in some ways that were here 100 years ago. So we're sort of facing the same problems, and we're sort of looking at the same solutions where, you know, the new government gets in and at the start of their term, they're introducing quotas to the streamers. And actually quotas were introduced at the start of the 20th century and fell over because of pressure from the American studios, which led to the death of the Australian film industry. So again, history's kind of cycling back around at the moment.
And you talk about how Fox Studios is now Disney.
Yeah.
Which I didn't know.
I don't think people really clocked onto that.
I know, I didn't know that happened. Yeah, so, and often as actors, and I've had this a lot, we receive this advice of going overseas is a really great thing to do for your acting career because it's also kind of limited in some ways here and the industry here. Was that a reason that these four actors that you talk about kind of pursued work over there?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, just so to be clear, the four actors are Errol Flynn, Peter Finch, Gulpilil and Nicole Kidman, and they all obviously have wildly different experiences with America and encountering America. You know, Flynn is an interesting case sample where he only made one movie in Australia, In the Wake of the Bounty by Charles Cheval in 1933. He then went to Papua New Guinea for the second time to try and make his riches for the second time and failed spectacularly. Then he went to London and cut his teeth on the stage and then tried to get discovered. There's a bit of a myth about Errol Flynn that he was discovered out of nowhere, and that's kind of true, but he was also getting driven by his mother up to the Warner Brothers studios in London and knocking on the door and taking out...
You didn't have TikTok to
no.
get discovered through it.
Well, he was taking out, you know, page advertisements for himself, you know, pretending to be an Olympic boxer, which was one of the many lies he told.
Yes,
but he
disclaimer, actors don't try that. That wouldn't work now.
But he did get discovered eventually, but pretty quickly, like In the Wake of the Bounty, which is a terrible Australian movie, was 1933, and then his big entrance into Hollywood's 1935 with Captain Blood. So I think he sort of knew that the work opportunities just weren't going to be there in Australia. Peter Finch certainly knew it and got a little bit distracted. You know, but again, this kind of circling back to his history thing, Australia held a royal commission into the moving picture industry or the film industry in 1927, so we're coming up to that centenary pretty quickly. And in the final report that was delivered to the government there was already kind of, you know, sort of statements saying, we know there's a brain drain happening, there's not much we can do to stop it, and there's really nothing we can do to incentivize people to come back. So, you know, that's kind of... but then you get up to Nicole and she sort of does come back because we're sort of more in a globalist world. So, and she has family who she likes to visit.
Yeah, and I can't remember exactly, but was it the 50s and the 60s in particular, there was some, you know, count on one hand kind of amount of films made
in
Australia.
After the Second World War, the Australian film industry took a massive nosedive. Menzies had no interest in reviving things. He was very happy with the British films coming in. And so really, if you wanted to become an expert on Australian cinema in the mid-century, you could do it in about a month. There's about 16 movies, I think, made in the 60s and maybe 25 in the 1950s. So you could really burn through those and, you know, become an expert very quickly.
Oh, well, there's some advice. Great. So the inclusion of David Gulpilil, I really loved reading about that section, and kind of one of the challenges, or the challenges that actors, I think, do still face, people of colour and Indigenous people trying to pursue their careers. It was amazing to read about somebody that long ago pursuing a career, but of course facing many challenges that white folk wouldn't necessarily face. Can you talk a little bit about how the challenges he faced and then how he kind of persevered and made a career?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Gulpilil, maybe wasn't an obvious person to put in a book about the connection between Hollywood in particular, but he went to America quite a number of times. And there's an interesting relationship there that I kind of go into in the book, but he was important to put in there as well because I genuinely think he's the most historically consequential Australian actor of all time, and I don't think we've even got to the start of reckoning with what his legacy will be. You can definitely see in 100 years' time people will still be talking about this 15-year-old kid who broke into the Australian cinema and world cinema and sort of changed everything forever, really. And it really helps that all of his films are really fantastic and will stand the test of time too. But like when you say that 15-year-old kid, you've got to think about the kind of real world material conditions that he had to face that other actors didn't. And one of those was in getting cast in Walkabout at 15. It was the production company being in conversation with the Northern Territory government and him actually kind of being in state care essentially. But from there, he kind of exploded. Walkabout was really well received. It was a bit critically mixed, but took him to Cannes. 20th Century Fox picked it up for international distribution, which took him to London and to New York, which he hated New York, San Francisco, LA, all by the time of 17. And then he doesn't make another movie for about 5 years. He makes Mad Dog Morgan, which is this great bushranger film, and Dennis Hopper comes in from America to play Mad Dog and gets drunk and gets into all kind of chaotic scenes. And then Gulpilil sort of breaks into the Australian mainstream through Storm Boy and being beloved by school children because that film was so popular. And then he does a movie called Crocodile Dundee, and it just is still somehow the biggest Australian movie of all time in America and Australia. We're coming up to 40 years and we still haven't beat it, which is kind of sad. And that movie made about $500 million in today's money then, and Gulpilil said, I want $1 million, and Paul Hogan said no, and recast him. So, and then he has a dry spell through the 90s and a late career revival. But those are all the kind of conditions that just other actors wouldn't have to put up with.
Yeah, and thankfully there's been a lot of changes since then, and it's definitely still a battle that's being fought. But that representation thing is so important, and it's really kind of inspirational to read about an actor going through that and how he fought for it, even though he didn't get the $1 million.
Yeah.
So looking to the future, that's the next bit of the quote, the future of Australian cinema. You talk about a film called Here Out West, which was released last year, so not quite in the future. But I found that bit really inspiring as an actor in terms of reading about actors getting together and making something, and then you talked about further projects which required funding and they didn't get it, and one of those things that we get told as actors is, get out there and make your own work, and often that's quite challenging because where do you get the money and how do you do that, and if you don't get the funding? And so I found that quite uplifting and hopeful as an actor to read about that film. Do you think this is a kind of exciting sample of the kind of Australian cinema that's ahead of us?
Yes. Here Out West was a bright light last year in terms of the fact that it existed at all. I think it was a really strong concept to essentially Here Out West was sort of like an arts project in some ways. At the start, it was putting together 8 young writers from Western Sydney in a room together and saying, each of you write a short film, and they were going to do a web series eventually, but I think they quickly clocked on to how excellent the writers were, and they were like, let's turn this into a feature film, and got a lot of funding for it. The end of that story dims a little bit because I feel like Screen Australia should have had about $100,000 checks for each of the writers at the end of that process and gone, go away and make your own movie, and instead it's been a little bit quiet afterwards. I think we get into this we like to put people in emerging and developing categories and kind of keep them there as long as we can. I mean, you know, I'm totally uninvested in the film industry as a creator. I do my little writing. I would actually burn Screen Australia to the ground if I could and start again. I just think there's too much bureaucracy. It's time to start again. You know, like I think really the best it ever was when it started, which was really under the Australia Council, and it was called the Experimental Film Fund, and they would give money to anyone because nobody had any experience in the film industry, and out of that you get Peter Weir, you know, that kind of generation, and I just feel like every generation deserves, you don't have to prove yourself, like how do you prove yourself in the film industry? It's like you need multi-millions of dollars, just give people $100,000 and just go make what you can and put it up at the film festival.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, a lot of people amazingly are so creative these days with my joke about TikTok earlier, but things like, you know, making stuff and just putting it up online. But you're right, the actual challenge of really making something, having to do it, and get it out there is really tough. And it's funny you mentioned about that emerging thing. I've certainly faced that myself as an actor. Is it like, I think I even said in the thing, I won an award about being an emerging actor. And I'm like, cool. Am I emerged now? Like what am I called once I've got a few rungs on the board, you know? And it is hard to then kind of do that next thing. And you know, with the strike going on at the moment, that's also something that, you know, everyone is talking about, how things like AI are going to affect even the experience of being an extra, as a way that you can kind of be on the film set. And, you know, maybe you don't have lines and have other stuff to do, but you're there and you get to kind of experience it. I've been an extra before, and that's, you kind of go, okay, I'm kind of understanding how this is all working, so that when I get to the point where I get to have some words to say, and if that gets taken over by AI, that's kind of scary.
Yeah.
But speaking of being featured extras, I believe you yourself can call yourself an actor these
Featured
days.
extra, yeah.
So can you tell us a bit about that experience?
Yeah, well, the epilogue of the book, I got an opportunity. So one of the writers of Here Out West is a friend of mine, and instead of getting a check for $100,000 from Screen Australia, she got nothing. And then she went, well, I want to make a film. So she just put her own money into making a film out in Western Sydney, and has done it, and it's in the can. Hopefully it'll be out next year sometime, hopefully at the film festival. And I just went, oh my God, here's this opportunity to wrap up this project that I've been working on for 5 years at my desk, but actually go and see how a film gets made. And then she kind of roped me into being an extra, playing a really horrible character called Paul, who doesn't have any lines, but is doing some really nasty kind of social work stuff in the background. And I just, it was a really good experience in terms of like seeing a film set, because, coming from it from a theoretical background can kind of be tricky, and then having that opportunity to have some close-ups and that kind of thing, you just like the camera, just the impressiveness of the camera suddenly hit me, and then all of these subjects who I'd spent so long writing about, I had a bit of empathy for them in terms of I have no idea how they did what they did in terms of being in front of the camera and making it work. So it was a lovely little insight right at the end.
Amazing. One of my first experiences in front of the camera was when I was in primary school, and I had to walk through the playground at the primary school, and the camera was here, and they said, just walk and look sad, but don't look down the barrel. And I remember being like, how do I not look down the barrel? It's here. And so anyway, I'm much better now than I was back then, but I remember that feeling of like, how do they do this? How do when it's at you? And then I was in a children's thing where you look at the camera, so the opposite, you do look down the barrel to kind of go like, hi, And then I went back to a really serious filming thing, and I found myself wanting to check in and smile, and I had to go, no.
I did a student film once, and this was first year of uni, and I was playing the driver, And I was kind of, oh, maybe I could be an actor. And then they got me to, they shot it in those tiny back streets of King Street in Newtown. And that's driving there is, the worst at the best of times. And then, but doing it while a camera's on you and being like, it was just terrifying. So I just went, no, I'm not going to act.
Many of your actors in the book talk about their experience of actual methods of acting, and in particular Peter Finch. Can you talk a little bit about his approach?
Yeah, look, Finchy, as he was known, is probably the least known of the Four Figures now, but he's probably the most engaged with acting. He was very passionate about the theatre, and particularly in Australia and in Sydney. He wanted to start a national theatre from out of Sydney. He started a theatre company called the Mercury, which famously lifted its name from Orson Welles' company, the Mercury, probably thinking that Wells would never find out. And yeah, extremely passionate about it. A really kind of democratic concept behind the theatre, which was they would do plays at lunchtime for workers. So we'd do surf clubs and factories and just try and do condensed plays in an hour at lunch for the workers. And actually, he was on the factory floor of a glass factory in Woolloomooloo when Vivian Leigh and Laurence Olivier came as emissaries and watched him, and then changed his life because Olivier tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Why don't you come to London?" And then that kind of killed the national theatre that might have come out of Sydney at that time. But yeah, very engaged, very into the kind of method acting and that kind of thing, but got a bit waylaid himself, sort of ended up in a film career in British films and didn't enjoy it, and kind of hated Hollywood as well, so wasn't a passionate film actor until he sort of came roaring back right at the end with Sunday Bloody Sunday, which is an amazing film, and Network, which got him the Oscar after he died.
Yes, so speaking of Oscars, two of your actors that you talk about win Oscars. Can you tell us a bit about their two different experiences of that?
Yeah, sure. They both really wanted Oscars. They campaigned hard. Finch really, really, really wanted an Oscar, and he was doing something like